Hello everyone, I'm Victoria Lemieux, Senior Public Sector Specialist here at the World Bank. I'd like to welcome you to the Open Learning Campus webinar on threats to openness in the digital world. In today's webinar, we'll be exploring themes discussed in this year's World Development Report called Digital Dividends. As the report notes, digital technologies have spread rapidly in much of the world, but the broad development benefits of using these technologies has lagged behind. In many cases, digital technologies have boosted growth, expanded opportunities, and improved service delivery, yet their aggregate impact has fallen short and is unevenly distributed. In my background paper for the World Development Report entitled One Step Forward, Two Steps Backward, Does the E-Government Make Governments in Developing Countries More Transparent and Accountable?, I discuss growing evidence related to the downside risk for government openness associated with the way that government information is now created and managed in digitally enabled public sector contexts. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Julie MacLeod, Michael Moss, and David Thomas of Northumbria University in the United Kingdom, who will be presenting on a recent conference they organized on threats to openness in a digital world. Their conference explored the paradox of a world in which we have increasing amounts of government data, even big data, but may have less and less capacity and scope to make this data accessible. So with this introduction, I would like to hand over to Professor Julie MacLeod to start us off. Welcome, Professor MacLeod. Over to you.
Thanks, Victoria, very much indeed. And first of all, thank you for the chance to share a summary of some of the outcomes of our recent conference. Just to build on what you said already, this conference was prompted by our concerns about whether or not the rapid growth of digital records will mean more material will become available to researchers, or with the growing emphasis on privacy, etc., will that mean fewer records will be released? And so in that context, we organised a 1.5-day conference. And let me just show you something of the context and the conference aims. The aim was to consider and to debate the issues surrounding the growing threats to citizens' rights to access public archives in the digital world. A world that, as you've already said, has made access to and review of records more complex and challenging. So why did we think this was an important conference topic? Well, I think it can be best illustrated by some examples. So, for instance, UK government proposals around changes to the Freedom of Information Act, the new EU data protection regulations, alongside the right to be forgotten and the work of the EU Working Party 29, and a ruling that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, that the EU Court of Justice upheld in 2014 about Google, where a Spanish citizen requested Google removed links to his name that made links to an article in a printed newspaper back in the late 1990s about something that was no longer, he felt, relevant, but was personal to do with his financial situation. And then, of course, we've got the EU Court of Justice striking down the Safe Harbour Agreement on export of data for processing to the USA. And from the private sector, we've had the demand for transparency and accountability in, for instance, last year's case of Volkswagen and the emissions data and the testing of their emissions data. So the notion of access to information in the digital world and balancing privacy and security versus access either for research, for our democracy, for economic benefit is not an easy one to balance. So it's a big question, and there are many facets to it. But our conference aimed to consider some of the facets and to debate some of the issues that were surrounding the situation with the digital, and importantly to try and discuss what action was needed. So to that end, we invited a series of speakers purposely chosen to represent a range of roles and different perspectives from different disciplines, and they included some leading figures in the records and archives discipline and beyond. And we asked them to talk about and share their views from their different expertise and experience. And we focused on 4 themes for the conference: the context, so the digital context and the nature of the record, the legal perspective, some experience of current issues, including trust and consent, and then this final session when we tried to look at what must be done. And I just must thank our sponsors, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust and the IT as a Utility organisation in the UK for supporting us. So what we're going to do over the next few minutes is to give you a flavour of each of those sessions, and we're going to start with the context, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Michael Moss to do that.
Thanks, Julie. What I'm going to talk about to start with is the paper that was given by myself and Tim Gollance, who's Head of Digital Preservation in the National Records of Scotland. And our first slide shows helps to illustrate what the threat might be, that the door is shut and you can't get in. And there are 3 big problems that we identify with the digital archive. And by archive, we don't just mean records that are kept for historical reasons, because with the reduction in the period about which documents are released in the United Kingdom from 30 to 20 years, they will now have relevance, certainly to the press, for accountability as much as for historical research. The first problem, and I think before I say what the problems are, I think you need to put in the back of your mind the whole debate about digital preservation, because in some ways that is an enormous distraction, and it has failed to concentrate the minds on these 3 fundamental problems. And the first problem is what to keep. And we know from reviews that David Thomas, who will be speaking shortly, will refer to, of UK government record keeping, that all the attempts to try and impose discipline on digital records in government have largely failed. And the same seems to be true in the private sector. All these great pronouncements about EDRMS systems and file plans have fallen largely on deaf ears. And you can understand why that is, because people are very busy, government expenditure is being cut, and what we have is a chaotic mess. So there is a massive problem about how to identify what to keep, and having done that, what then should be kept. And there are some emerging technologies that can help address that problem, developed largely in the States by places like MIT and by Carnegie Mellon, but where you can reduce the bulk, but certainly not to the scale that used to be the case in the past. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, which we haven't time to go into this afternoon. The second problem is sensitivity review. Now, what do we mean by sensitivity review? We don't mean lots of creepy stuff about spies. What we actually mean is content that cannot be released for a variety of reasons. So, for example, if any government in the world divulges information to the British government or vice versa in confidence, then it remains closed. Personal information remains closed for up to 125 years, and again, we respect reciprocity. So if somebody makes disparaging remarks about a ruler of a foreign country, that will be closed, even though data protection legislation may not apply in that country. Now, interestingly, much data protection legislation is becoming universal. because, as Julie has indicated, the safe harbour arrangements means that if you want to play in the digital space and you want to accept data from third-party countries, you're going to have, by statute, something that looks very like EU data protection laws. And some countries have already done that. Mexico has adopted the EU directive, and so has Singapore, and there are others in the pipeline. So we can expect that to happen. The trouble with sensitivity review is that if the records are disorganized, trying to identify things that might be considered sensitive for the regime or the company in which you operate is astonishingly difficult, because unlike the paper world where we have files and we can look through them and see things that are sensitive, if it's all in a great mess and we expect it to be so, and you've only got to look at big releases like Enron to know this is the case, then the only way we can resolve that problem is by developing technologies that will help semi-automate the process. And the third problem is one of access. How are people going to access this stuff? And using Google, which is only a 50-50, it's entirely happenstance Google. It is not a robust search engine despite what it says. And you're going to have to use much more advanced technologies. And those haven't been developed. But again, there are developments, particularly in the States, places like the History Lab at Columbia, that are looking at ways that this can. So those are three big global challenges we see. The second issue that we looked at, and again this affects every country in the world, and there is enormous pressure on governments and academics to respect what to do about scientific records because of the notorious cases where data has simply been invented, and that there is a requirement that research data should be made available publicly for other people to test the results, good scientific practice. And Jeremy Frey, who is Professor of Chemistry at Southampton University and leads something called IT as a Utility Initiative in Britain, spoke compellingly about this topic. It presents big challenges because, particularly for medical data, if you're going to make that public, then you have got to wrap it around with sufficient security that the people who use it don't abuse it by identifying individuals. And because of the pressure for international publication, particularly in English, so wherever you are in the world, whether your phonic community is not English, the pressure is to publish in English, and that means you've got to make your data available because the peer reviewers will expect it. And so that is another really big challenge, and it presents some analogous issues that fit in with government data, because there are ways of making this data available. Yale University in its emulation service has pioneered with a drug company, Johnson & Johnson, ways of making their drug trial data available to other users. And I think we have to look very carefully at those sorts of experiments. And you can see much the same in the States, in the State Department, or in the Pentagon, that makes its FOI inquiries available in virtual libraries. So we have a lot to learn transdisciplinary from where we are, from the scientific community. And the last area that we looked at around this theme is the archives of war. Now, you may think this is not very germane to what you might be doing in your particular community. But what is interesting about war and contemporary warfare is it is a much more complicated information space than it ever was in the past. And we can see that very clearly by just looking at the news. If you look at what's happening in Syria, we have competing interests, many of which are being manipulated by social media. Now, the British Army captures all this stuff. And in the archive, the historical record, which isn't really a historical record, it's an information base that is used for future campaigns. Since 2001, they have 10 million declared records and 60 million undeclared records. And these will range from the streams that come out of the back of a rangefinder when it's firing shells to the capture of vast quantities of social media which analyze to make up the package of information that is needed to conduct modern warfare. And it's an area that is well worth exploring because that information is so critical to the conduct of future operations. Then they have developed mechanisms for analysing and using it, but they are also stumped by both the volume of data and by means of navigating it. And now I'm going to hand over to David, who will take us through the next part of our conference.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to talk a bit about the first paper in my section, which was the paper I gave. And I talked about many of the things that Michael's already addressed, the difficulty of getting people to save records in the digital world. I talked about the question of volume, because while business and governments have got access to increasingly large and cheap volumes of storage, and so the volume of storage is going down, the same cannot be said for the cost of records management. Consequently, the cost of forgetting data by selective deletion requires more effort and is more costly than it was in the paper world. At the same time, as is well known, there are issues about the tendency of some civil servants and elected ministers to not document decision-making processes, or to use informal technologies which are outside the scope of FOI. And Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server to conduct State Department business is very well known. But it also turns out that the Prime Minister of Australia used a non-government email server for government business. And the rapid introduction of emails and other forms of digital communication means there are much more difficult problems about preservation and about applying metadata. Before emails, incoming and outgoing post was registered in post rooms. Now ministers and senior officials send their own emails, and few of these get registered in record-keeping systems. I also talked about some work that's been done on the records of ISIS, Islamic State, and an organisation called the Quilliam Foundation has tried to capture the media output of IS. This is very difficult for two reasons. First of all, IS have got a lot of media offices. They've got 35 media offices, most of which put out something every day. But the other problem is that social media organisations such as Twitter try and stop IS media output being broadcast to prevent radicalisation. So capturing their output is actually very difficult. And it was a kind of game between Twitter and Quilliam and IS for Quilliam to capture their media. But over a period of a month last year, they managed to capture 1,300 media feeds from IS. And capturing these is a difficult process, but it's important if we are to understand radicalisation and to look back at the history of what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. The next speaker was David Erdos, who's from the faculty lecturer in Law and Open Society at the University of Cambridge. And he talks about the current state of the EU data protection landscape and how it's set to change. As Michael said, basically data protection legislation throughout the world is coming to be the same. Everything is based on the EU legislation, and changes in the EU legislation are important. I think the main message coming out of Erdos's talk is that people in the humanities and in social sciences really need to wake up to these changes, that the EU is going to change the legislation, and people in these areas, these academic areas, really need to defend themselves in the way that the biomedical people have done to ensure that they are able to continue their research in the new legislative regime. And the next speaker was David Wilcox of the National Archives of the UK. And he talks about the impact of born digital records on existing processes for transferring records to the National Archives and their availability to the public. As Michael mentioned, the change to the public records legislation means that records should be transferred to the National Archives no later than 20 years after creation. And this means that born digital record transfers will become business as usual from this year. This brings new challenges for appraising and selecting records due to the anticipated large volumes and less structured format of born digital records. Once the selection of born digital records has been completed, the challenge of balancing openness with sensitivity review to ensure compliance with the Data Protection Act and the Freedom of Information Act need to be addressed. Beyond the technological questions, there are fundamental questions to be explored. How can legislative requirements and risk appetite be reconciled to achieve the right balance when releasing born digital records? Does the pervasiveness and accessibility of born digital records present unique issues not experienced in the paper world? Will these considerations mean that existing policies and processes will need to be amended, or will the review and release of born digital records require an entirely new approach? The next speaker is Agnes Jonker from the Archive School, the Netherlands Institute for Archival Education. Now, nice picture of Amsterdam on your screen. And she talked about how the Dutch treat access to the public record and how it compares with the United Kingdom. In the Netherlands, they've had a Freedom of Information Act since 1980, which was 20 years before our own Freedom of Information Act in the UK. And so there's a generally more relaxed air about the concept. But there are some criticisms of the Dutch legislation, and a new FOI law was proposed in 2013, although it won't be enforced for a few years. And this is being done to update changes. What's happening is the Dutch state is shrinking, and a lot more stuff is being privatised, and third-party contractors are escaping FOI scrutiny. The Dutch law is different from UK law because it has a greater emphasis on knowing where records are and how to find them. One very interesting issue she raised, which I think is worth considering more widely, is the question of whether there should be a legal duty to document. This issue was raised by Elizabeth Denham, who is the Information Commissioner for British Columbia in Canada, following a major scandal where documents were destroyed to foil FOI requests. And I think this is an issue which will come to the fore in other countries in the future. The next speaker was Sir Alex Allen, who was a former permanent secretary at the Ministry of Justice and had various senior roles in government. Alex Allen takes a rather different view from many of us about records management. He thinks it's not just about preserving the historical record, it's also important for the efficient running of offices. So if civil servants are asked about an issue, it's important they should be able to look back through the records and see when they last discussed it and what their views were then. And they need to be able to find the papers that relate to the discussions and decisions. We get this every few years in the UK when we get an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, and the Ministry of Agriculture needs to go back to the records of the previous outbreak. It's also, you think it's good records management is important for audit and accountability. And it's also very important for providing evidence to public inquiries and legal proceedings. There have been a number of public inquiries in the UK where all the documents which were needed for the inquiry haven't been produced, and there have been some embarrassing occasions when they've subsequently been produced after the report was published. Sir Alex has conducted 2 reviews into the state of digital records in the UK. The first looked at the move from the 30-year rule to the 20-year rule, and he discovered that there are some big delays. The UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office will only have transferred 40% of the relevant records to the National Archives by 2023. Alan's second review looked at the management of electronic records more generally. He said that by and large the guidance that had been issued by government departments was okay, but the implementation was the problem. The main difficulty seems to be that in the digital world, users are required to do their own filing, which is complicated and difficult to do, particularly with EDRMS systems. He said he didn't know where government was going with its technology. Some departments, such as the Cabinet Office, were moving to Google Documents. He was very, very interested in this idea of the capstone policy, which is being used by the United States National Archives. The inboxes of very senior staff are captured in total. And Nara believes, and he believes them, that this has greatly helped them in capturing vital information. The final speaker I'm going to talk about is Arthur Lucas, who used to be principal of King's College London, and was a member of the Lord Chancellor's Advisory Council. He's one of the generation of people who are interested in the public understanding of science, and had a chair in that at one stage, I think. The Advisory Council oversees the process of opening and closing records. According to Lucas, 75% of the documents going into the National Archives are closed, but 3/4 of those are closed because of personal sensitivity. He points out that transferring a document closed isn't a way to bury a record, because its status can be challenged by an FOI request in the future. As Michael said earlier on, Lucas talked about sensitivity review, which is currently done by humans, page by page, and it presents a real conundrum in the digital age. The nature of sensitivity review is inherently tricky for computers, but sheer volume means that bringing in technology is the only answer. He talks about the use of technology, e-discovery tools to apply categorization or clustering to unstructured information, software to help highlight themes, events and people, which might help with reducing duplication. He says there's around 40% duplication in government records. And because 75% of exemptions relate to personal information, this is a good starting point for the use of data mining technology, as it should be easier for software to highlight easily identifiable fields such as names and addresses. He also talks about the recent and not well publicised reclosure program by the Atomic Weapons Authority, where 8% of previously open records have been reclosed on security grounds. Finally, Arthur Lewis brought up the discussion to the question of what is of historical interest and who dictates it. He said there's no public involvement in decisions about which records are to be kept and which destroyed, and clearly there's an accountability gap here. So now I'm going to hand over to Julie.
So the final speaker of the conference was Mary Daly, who's part based at University College Dublin and at the Royal Irish Academy. And she shared, well, her presentation was fascinating. Someone described it as enthralling on our blog. Partly, I think, because she used some real examples from commissions, Irish commissions and the Irish banking crisis to illustrate so perfectly what can happen if events or decisions aren't officially recorded and accessible. She had us laughing, but at quite serious things, and it was because it was the kind of thing we really know happens but wish didn't. And her analysis was based on a lot of research, not just by her, but by some others who she acknowledged, looking at documentary evidence where it existed and where it didn't, holding interviews with people. Now, the presentation slides that are on the conference website provide all the detail of the cases, but I just thought I would try to give you a sense of the kind of things she shared with us from her research, from a few of the comments that have stayed with me and that I noted during the event. She talked about the long cabinet meeting where consensus seemed to have been achieved through exhaustion. So they were in this meeting for just so long, she reckoned they were just beaten down to consensus. And she even referred to attendees sending out for fish and chips to eat as it went on through the night. And yet very little record of what happened. And then a short 1 hour meetings where there was very little record as well, and it was just a case of, oh well, we couldn't have discussed very much in 1 hour. She has numerous references to the absence of documentation, sketchy records, of intensive but informal meetings, non-existence of detailed documentation, meetings between the governor, I think if it was one of the banks, and a minister, at which there were no officials present and where there appeared to be no records of the discussions. She also said something about there was only one person at the meeting who had a pen to actually record things. And then she talks about discussion over what happened in terms of destruction of records, which seems to be very casual and certainly not standard practice or recorded policy. And the result was, in all of these cases, she looked at two main ones. She had lots of anecdotal but evidenced examples. The result was, in all of these cases, that it was very unclear what information decisions had been based on. In other words, there was a lack of transparency in the process. Now, she acknowledged at the event that some of the events were, if you like, crisis situations. So fast decisions had to be made, it was stressful. So it's acceptable that record keeping might not have taken the highest priority. But it was an issue, and basically her message was one that I think Michael mentioned earlier, and certainly David mentioned earlier, about the need to document. And it's interesting, one of the comments she made was a sense of worry of decision makers about recording their actions. And yet there is evidence in the UK from research undertaken by the Constitution Unit at the University of London that the Freedom of Information Act hasn't resulted in less documentation. So hers was a very entertaining way to end the formal session of the conference. And what we want to do now is we've given you a sense of what the speaker was talking about, but we want to give you a sense of what the event was like and what people were actually saying immediately after the event or on the second day during the event. So we're going to play a video which is about 7 minutes long that we took on, that was made on the second day to give you a sense of what participants thought.
Threats to openness is an important topic, and one of the things that's been brought out over the last 2 days has been issues like the conflict between privacy, freedom of expression, and some of the issues around digital
So, I hope you found that summary video interesting, and we're just going to try and wrap up the formal part and then hopefully have some questions and answers. But just to say that the final session of the conference was trying to look to the future, as a few people said on that video. And so we had a discussion where we asked the participants, what should we be doing? What actions should we be taking? And so on this slide here, you can see what we asked them. We asked them what was the key issue or challenge, whether it was a research question, a political issue, an archival issue, or something else. And therefore, what was the most important action that was needed to try and tackle that? Why was it important, and who should be responsible? And how urgent was it? So we do have some results. We would be really interested to hear or read in the chat your thoughts on what the key challenges might be. But I'll just share one or two with you before I hand back to Victoria. So one of the issues that came up as important was how to assess risk in order to prevent lockdown, so making genuine risk-assessed decisions. Another one was about the implications of the right to be forgotten that we've talked about, and the implications for having to review and delete personal data. And then picking up on the things that Michael and David have alluded to earlier, the whole issue of technology. With the volume of digital data that we're talking about now, we cannot use old methods. So it was about the need for more research and development into software for appraisal, for sensitivity review, for retention, etc. And one of the final ones I'd share with you, perhaps to let you think about, reflect on, was this is all very well, but who will pay for this? What will it cost, and who will pay for such improvements? So, I think with that, I'll hand back to Victoria.
Wonderful. Thank you, all of you, for raising some fascinating issues in a conference that looked to cover such a broad breadth of the issues that really relate to managing records and how records are created in a digital environment, and which you, in the video, emphasized, Professor MacLeod, affects a wide range of stakeholders, all of society, and not just in the UK, but in fact globally, as we see here in the World Bank. So we're very delighted that you have encapsulated so many of these issues. What we'd like to do now, I'd like to encourage all of you who are participating in this webinar to post any questions or comments that you have to our three presenters into the chat area. And while you're doing that, we're also going to consider some poll questions just to get your feedback, some high-level thoughts. So the first poll question that we'd like to put to all of you is, how important do you think is the duty to document government activities that was mentioned? So I'm just going to give it a few minutes or a few seconds for all of you to respond. And we're seeing the answers to the poll questions coming in. Most of you, looking about 71% approximately, think it's extremely important. An additional 25% think it's very important, and 12.5% think it's not important. So I'd like to ask Professor MacLeod if she would like to comment on the responses to the poll questions that we're seeing.
Thank you. I think the most fascinating thing here is the 12.5% that says not important, because I think all of the things that we've said so far, particularly Mary Daly's presentation, the duty to document was very clear, and the consequences of not. So I think the most interesting one there is the persons who think it's not important. And I wonder if that's a risk-assessed view. I would just be fascinated to know about that, because I expected it to be all at the other end. for the reasons that we've discussed throughout the session here: transparency, accountability, and actually, and I share Sir Alex Allen's view, standing on the shoulders of giants and not reinventing the wheel and learning from mistakes. So for me, the most fascinating thing there is they're not important.
And it could just be relative to other issues that particular contexts or countries are facing. So in some situations, the other pressing issues, I mean, in Africa, West Africa last year, we had the Ebola virus, and it's difficult to think about these long-term risks to fundamental institutional structures in society when faced with more immediate threats and health risks. So that could explain it, but I too would be very interested. Our next question is, in your context, what effect does computerization have on documentation of government activities? So are you noticing in your context, in your country, some of the same issues? And so we're getting the responses coming in now. So it looks like approximately 66% think that it's better documented as a result of computerization, and about 33% think much less well documented. So I'd like to ask David to comment on the responses to this question.
That spread of marks is actually a real reflection of the situation. In some ways, obviously, things are much better documented, but and certainly, much more information is created, things are done much more quickly. But I think that in terms of the long-term preservation, long-term access to government information, then things are probably much worse in many ways. The problem is things, as Julie mentioned, the huge volume issue, the vast volume of digital records that are coming on, but also that things are changing really more quickly, I think, than we can deal with, because we've moved from a situation where the issue was about preserving digital documents, which has more or less been solved, but now there are problems about how we deal with emails, and nobody quite knows how to deal with that. And while we're thinking about that, the big problems about the increasing government use of social media and how we preserve Twitter's tweets and other forms of social media. So I think the spread between 33% saying it's less well documented and 66% it's that it is well documented pretty much reflects my own views, I think. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, David. Before we run out of time, I'd really like to turn now to some of the questions we're seeing in the chat space, and we're getting some really good questions through. So one of our first questions was from Mr. Abdelaziz Abid, who I know from Morocco. He's been involved in developing Morocco's right to information law, and he's asking, is secrecy more broad-based in the digital era? Is digital secrecy more of a threat to open digital archives than, say, old formats, paper formats? So what's worse, paper or digital for openness? And I'm going to put this question to Michael.
Well, I think it partly goes back to what I said. If you worry about file formats and digital preservation, I think you're looking in the wrong direction. There are much more fundamental questions, like the three issues that I put up, and much of that has been resolved by the industry. If you think about it, that's something the industry has to resolve itself, and so we should be worrying about the content and about the really big issues that I referred to. I think you can divert your gaze towards digital preservation and lose sight of things that just mean that it'll all be shut.
Thank you, Michael. And moving on to the next question, this one comes in from Elizabeth Oxborough-Cowan, and she asks, should freedom of memory be formally enshrined as a principle in legislation and practice around record keeping? And I'm going to put this question to David. Yes, that would be just fine. So I'm going to give Elizabeth Oxborough-Howe in a few minutes to just elaborate on her question, and we'll move on to a question from Swanhilder Bogadir. I'm sorry, Swanhilder, if I'm stumbling over your name. And so I'd like to just point this question to Julie. She mentioned the question of who will pay. So was, Julie, there any discussion of who will pay? How will these challenges be funded?
No, actually no. It was one of the actions, it was one of the suggestions for the future, and it was literally a question rather than an action. What will it cost and who will pay? And I think it's very interesting that the question here, will it be more expensive for the public to access public information in digital form than in paper form? Well, yes and no. It's easy if you have access to the web, and I think we take for granted that everyone does, and all of the government services in the UK are going digital. But there are many people who don't have access to it. So it might be cheaper and certainly faster and easier to get information anywhere in the world. But the cost of keeping that, I'm currently doing a project with actually someone who I think is online today at UBC that's looking at economic models for storing records in the cloud. And I think we've become very comfortable with it being very cheap to store things. I think we have almost cracked the digital preservation problem. Then it's how do we find those things and how do we make sense of all of the stuff amongst the volume. So I'm sorry, Svanhilda, I don't have an answer. I just think it's a really interesting question that needs more discussion.
Fair enough. And so now Elizabeth has come back with some further elaboration of her question for David. So David, she has indicated that by freedom of memory, she means the ability of the individual and organizations, to meaningfully recall the past for their own purposes. So again, she's asking if this should be formally enshrined as a principle in legislation and practice around record keeping.
This question, the whole question of co-creation, of working with communities, not only to record their cultural history, but also individuals and communities who are affected by individual record keeping decisions. I think records managers and archivists have got to work with them in the future. If you haven't done so, I would urge you to read the Shaw report on systemic abuse in children's homes in Scotland. Shaw spends a huge amount of time talking to people who are kept in children's homes in Scotland, who many of them suffered horrific abuse. And he just talks to them, one of the things he talks to them about is their attitude to records, what records mean to them. The fact is many of them can't find their records. When they find the records, they're inadequate, they don't tell them what they want to know, they're inaccurate, and so on. And I just think this idea of working with people about the creation of records is something that archivists and records managers really need to engage with in the future.
Yes, I totally agree with you there, David. Now, we haven't time for all of the other questions that we might ask. I'd like to squeeze one more question in, though, and I'd like to direct this question to Michael, actually. Michael, in many of the countries that are the bank's client countries, you mentioned, for example, the use of technology. In some of the presentations, this was emphasized as a solution to the challenges that we're facing now with digital records. And what I'm seeing in some of the background research that I've been doing here is that, first of all, the technical capacity of National Archives and records professionals in many of our client countries isn't there in order to take advantage of some of the new technologies. And also, the issue is that in the digital world, some of the agencies, public agencies that have been responsible for rolling out digital solutions are in one organizational structure, maybe an IT department, and National Archives sit in maybe a cultural department. And oftentimes you see the two aren't necessarily talking, so the IT department isn't aware of some of the issues that we've discussed here today. So I just wonder if you could reflect on some of these capacity issues and some of the issues around institutional arrangements that may need to be in place or change, or if indeed you think that that might be one of the issues that needs to be addressed.
Well, I certainly think it is, and the question is a very big question. In the country I'm most familiar with is Malawi, because the National Archivist is one of my former students. And although the President or the government has decided to go digital, partly by encouragement from the World Bank and other funding agencies, they simply don't have the connectivity to do it. They can do it locally, but they certainly can't provide the connectivity across the country. I think the mindset in a lot of, certainly sub-Saharan African countries, is still around wires and central servers. And the other bit of the industry in that part of the world I know very well is the savings bank, because I sit on the World Savings Bank group, and they use mobile technology, most of which is right in South Africa. So I think that some of the mindset has to move away from bits of wire and big servers towards perhaps big servers in a third-party country and using mobile technology. The mobile banking industry, particularly in Kenya, is astonishing, with micropayments, all well organized, pension payments, and a very elaborate security system that operates, which is run largely by the community. But you're absolutely right, capacity is a really big problem. And if you impose the digital on countries where there is no capacity, then you won't achieve anything. And I remember a memorable slide of a photograph from one of the royal households in Nigeria, and it showed two record-keeping African ladies standing beside the old pigeonholes. Remember the pigeonholes that were used for file sorting? And there they were, and they were busy filing, as had been done under the British regime, introduced presumably in the colonial period, and at their feet lay a dead computer. And I think that told you a lot about these really genuine problems, which I don't think the funding agencies always really understand. And that's just the technical capacity, because in Malawi, the National Archive also has a huge problem of capacity of qualified people to do the work. So you raise a big issue. We haven't time to answer it completely, but you're spot on.
Well,
Thank you.
I think then that calls for a follow-up session. I'd like to, at this point, just say we're out of time. Thank you so much to our presenters for a fascinating session, to all of our participants for their fabulous questions and engagement in this session. Please take the time to fill out the questionnaire and give us your feedback on this session. And also I invite you to visit the Threads to Openness website at the University of Northumbria, and also the World Bank's 2016 World Development Report on digital dividends for further information about these issues that we've discussed today. So thanks again everyone for joining, and see you next time. Bye-bye.